So, welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson, and I started an eco conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, at Oxford Clay, I don't just make pottery, I also make resources such as books and courses and information for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice but maybe don't know where to start or can't find out the information they need. So that's what this podcast is all about. It's about sharing everything I've learned along my eco-conscious pottery journey with you, and I can't wait to get started. So let's go. Hello, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm your host, Catherine Tomlinson, and in today's episode, this is so exciting because we're actually going to be doing the first Your Listener Questions episode. So, thank you so much for sending in your listener questions. It's so nice to read what kind of things you want to have answered on the podcast and your pottery queries. So, yeah, thank you so much. And if you wanted to send in your question for the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast, yeah, please do so. It's you just need to email your question to info@oxfordclay.co.uk with the email subject line podcast question. And then I know that you're happy for your question to be used on the Oxford Clay podcast. Okay, so today's question is from Nikki. So thank you so much, Nikki, for sending this in. And it's basically like a three-part question about glazing. We're going to be talking about sort of like glazing faults. Okay, so the question is it a defect of the glaze to have pinholes or hairline cracks after firing? Okay, so I've used a couple of books for this episode. The first one is Bernard Leach's A Potter's Book, classic pottery text from 1976, and then the other one I've used is Linda Bloomfield's The New Ceramics Color in Glazes, and both of these books talk about these two aspects of glazing. So yeah, if you want to read more on the topic, both of those books are really excellent for that. So okay, so the first thing to say is that cracking on on a glaze's sort of surface, like hairline cracks, or it can be just a few, or it can be like loads on the surface of a pot. This is known as crazing. So it's basically like a kind of almost like a shattering of the glaze's surface. On the pot. So crazing is generally considered a glaze fault. But there is also another way of thinking about crazing. That actually it can be part of like a decorative feature. So if you think about like something like raku actually uses crazing as part of its decorative aspect. And when it's used in a sort of decorative way, crazing has a kind of rebrand and it's known as crackle glaze. So you might have seen this like on say like tiles in a like a say like a bathroom tile shop or kitchen tiling shop. They sometimes have tiles known as like crackle tiles or crackle glaze tiles, and it's the same thing. So, as potters, we can use different glazes you can buy from the potter's merchant. And some of these will be like crackle glaze. And that's when it's like designed to craze. So, yes, I'm just showing a picture actually of like, a fish that I made at a raku workshop, which I did years ago, like when I was a teenager. So, yeah, raku glazes are designed to craze. They're crackle glazes, and this you can't see it too well on the picture, but basically it's like it's a fish with a kind of with a crackle glaze on, and it's all like it's got yeah, it's a crazed glaze basically, but that's the decorative feature. Okay, so the next thing that Nikki was asking about is pinholing, and pinholing is essentially when you get like small holes in the surface of the glaze. So yeah, it's basically in the glaze's surface. There'll be little holes. They can go all the way down to the pot's kind of fired surface, or they can just be like little pits on the surface of the glaze. So the reason that these two things are generally considered glazing defects is that crazing can reduce the strength of the pot. So it can sort of put the clay body like under stress, and it can reduce the strength of that pot. And also, probably the most popular reason is that they're considered faults is because it can cause like residue, say like food residue. If you're using that pot for like eating out of or like drinking a cup of tea or something, that can cause like food residue to become trapped in the glaze's surface. So that's why some potters are like, I don't want this in my pot. um, so um, right. So Nikki's second question is: are these fired glazes permeable, and will food residues settle in them over time, especially if you only wash them by hand? Okay, so I sort of checked like Linda Bloomfield's book, and Linda Bloomfield talks about this in terms of it can actually crazing can actually cause an earthenware pot in particular to become porous. Um, so yeah, so essentially what crazing will do is turn an earthenware pot into a permeable pot. So say like if you're going to try and use it for like a cup of tea, or maybe something which has got like, liquid standing in it over a long time, say like a vase, crazing isn't ideal in earthenware pottery. Um, but what Linda Bloomfield says is that in stoneware ceramics, like because the clay is fully vitrified, that pot basically is going to be impermeable to water, generally speaking. So that's why Linda Bloomfield's talking about it in earthenware pottery, because stoneware pottery generally the clay becomes it becomes impermeable to liquids. So if you have crazing in a stoneware pot, it's probably not too, you don't really have to worry about it too much in terms of it like becoming permeable. But if it's in an earthenware pot, yes, it could leak water. So, okay, so food residues. Yes, we just spoke about that a little bit. Yeah, so like I guess, yeah, this is something that that is can be problematic. So it's really just like your personal preference. If you if you think actually I don't want a pot that could potentially have any food residues in, then you need to find a glaze recipe that will craze less, because different recipes just craze at different rates basically. So I wanted to show you, I'm just showing a picture now of basically a mug that I use for a cup of tea. So this is a mug that I glaze actually with an ash glaze, and ash glazes are like notoriously terrible for crazing, and it's really hard to find an ash glaze that doesn't craze terribly on pottery. Yeah, so basically what's happened to the inside of my mug is that it's got loads of like tea stains in, and so I guess that is tea residue going into the in between the cracks of the glaze. And some people might not want that, but I don't really mind, to be honest. So um, I'm going to show you another picture now of like this is a bowl that I made, which is like terribly pinholed in the middle of the pot. So it's like a bowl, and in the base of the bowl, it's got like loads of kind of little holes basically in the glaze. And I mixed henna actually the other day in this pot, and then I hand washed it, and then some of the henna residue got like stuck in the pinholes. So again, this is personal preference. You might be like, I do not want this in my pottery, or you might be like, look, I'm just mixing henna in it, it's fine, I don't mind. So that was my kind of view. It's a very good shaped bowl, in terms of like the size of it and stuff. So I was just like, look, it's fine. I got pinholes, and they're filled with henna, but that's cool. Okay, so Nikki's final question is: can the items go in the dishwasher? Okay, so I basically put all of my handmade pottery, I always fire it to stoneware temperature. So I always put all of it in the dishwasher, and it's absolutely fine. And I mean, I was thinking about this, and perhaps it's probably a good thing for them to go in the dishwasher, because in the dishwasher, sometimes pottery, the temperature of the dishwasher does get hotter than when you hand wash. So perhaps that's a really good thing if you are getting, say, like henna residue stuck in your pinholed bowl. It's probably a good idea to put it in the dishwasher, because perhaps that would help with the whole kind of hygiene aspect of it. So yeah, this is really down to personal preference. So I showed you a picture of like a raku pot just a minute ago, raku's fish sculpture, and yeah, I wouldn't put raku in the dishwasher. That's some pottery is just kind of like more delicate than others, and raku's like low fired pottery. So yeah, it's not ideal to put like lower fired pottery in the dishwasher, but generally speaking, I just put all stoneware pottery in the dishwasher, and it seems to be fine. Nothing bad has happened so far, and I think it's probably a good thing if it's crazed or pinholed. Um, Okay, so let's talk about like if you wanted to prevent crazing. There's a lot of talk in the books I read about how to prevent crazing, and essentially it seems to be around tweaking the levels of silica and clay in the glaze recipe. So yeah, there was especially in a Potter's book in Bernard Leach's book. There was a lot of talk on like how to prevent crazing with different kind of recipe tweaks and stuff. Um, Bernard Leach also has this kind of interesting technique from that yeah he talks about in a Potter's book um, to prevent crazing. And so Bernard Leach writes a method employed in Japan consists in drying, calcinating at 700 degrees Celsius, and regrinding half of the glaze and then mixing it with the remainder. Wow. Okay. So that sounds like quite a lot of effort to go to prevent crazing. So essentially, that's firing in glaze, grinding it up, adding it back into more wet glaze. So my third point in terms of like preventing crazing is basically just perhaps the easiest way is just to get a glaze recipe that doesn't craze. So some recipes just are more prone to crazing than others. So I was saying about like ash glazing, a lot of ash glazes will craze, whereas like, some other glazes are much more sort of they're much less prone to glazing, much more kind of stable. You say like they don't really run in the kiln, they're much more viscous, they're much less prone to crazing. Um, but it can be just down to like the type of glaze that's used on a pot. So it's in terms of like the partnership. So one could say like contract more on that particular pot. And so it really is down to kind of like just experimenting, which is kind of an annoying thing to hear. But if you find a nice glaze that doesn't craze, glazy.org is a fantastic resource. I've got like 17 recipes in eco-conscious pottery glazing, that book, which is available on the Oxford Clay website. And some of those recipes do craze, but some of them don't. So yeah, for example, I'm just seeing one here, which is like 40 parts Cornish stone, 20 parts quartz, 15 parts china clay, 10 parts whiting, and 10 parts dolomite. That didn't craze at all, that recipe. So there's a lot of different recipes that don't craze. So it might just be down to sort of like yeah, testing out some ones and finding one that you like that doesn't craze. Um, Okay, so there's also a lot of chat in those two books about how to prevent pinholes. So yeah, especially in Linda Bloomfield's book. So Linda Bloomfield has loads of ideas on how to prevent pinholes. So um, so essentially, what Linda Bloomfield is saying is that pinholes are caused by kind of bubbles in the glaze that don't have time to kind of burst and then kind of she calls it like healing over. So I guess like the glaze like rejoining after that bubble has popped. So one of the things Linda Bloomfield suggests is soaking pottery that's been glaze fired at the very highest point of the kiln firing, soaking it for 15 to 30 minutes. And that should give like very viscous glazes time to kind of if there's any bubbles they should have popped and then they will like heal over and then that glaze will sort of like become like all the pinholes will disappear basically. um yeah, so soaking at very high temperature in the kiln is one thing you could try if you're getting pinholing. Another thing is which is ironic because I just read out a glaze recipe with whiting in, but Linda Bloomfield suggests not using glaze ingredients like whiting because they can create bubbles as they're being fired. They can create bubbles of like CO2, and that these can then, create a pinhole basically when the bubbles like floating up in the glaze. So again, reducing the level of quartz in a glaze can help, and then not using zinc oxide as well, because apparently the evaporation of the zinc in the zinc oxide can also cause bubbles in the glaze and essentially yeah create pinholes. And then and then conversely, Linda Bloomfield also says that over firing some glazes can cause pinholing as well. And I think this is maybe when it's been fired so much that the glaze is then like bubbling, and then these bubbles can then cause a pinhole. So it is kind of confusing, but like in terms of like it could be under fired or it could be over fired. So again, this is just going to be down to sort of like experimentation. Um, And then another thing that can cause pinholing is actually if bisqueware is under fired. And that's because carbon is then like burning out in the glaze firing. And I actually use paper in my pottery, in my clay, when I sort of mix paper fibers into my slip when I slip cast, and that like adds a lot of strength to the clay. But what it does is it adds a kind of element of a kind of extra element that needs to like burn out of the clay. So I have actually found this in my pottery, and I did think this is perhaps some of the reason that I'm experiencing like pinholing in my pottery, because that carbon is getting released at the glazing stage. Not ideal. But okay, so yeah, so right, so that those are all the questions. So thank you so much to Nikki for those questions, and yeah, wishing you really happy potting. Like I said, those two books are great resources if you wanted to learn more about like crazing and pinholing. But like I said, it's really just kind of trying to find a recipe that if you're experimenting with different glazes, it's just finding a recipe that doesn't craze essentially. And then pinholing, could be down to those things we talked about. But again, it could just be maybe trying a different glaze. um, so yeah, so that's been so nice to talk about your list of questions, and I'm really yeah, really looking forward to more questions coming in and doing another episode on list of questions. So thank you so much, and yeah, I'll see you on the next episode of the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. Yeah, until then, wishing you very happy potting, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye. Oh, yeah. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you're interested to learn more about eco conscious pottery or making your pottery more eco conscious and sustainable, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. I can't wait to see you there.